to talk through the 23-24 prosecutor's budget. Looks like we have a full presentation, so I'll turn it over to the prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my thanks first and foremost to the commission as a whole. I think that really the importance of these budget presentations is vital in helping to assist the DOCC in understanding how the proposals came to be and why certain departments or offices believe they're necessary. So I appreciate you guys giving it time and attention this year. And my thanks to Tammy as the clerk for all of her efforts that I know go in behind the scenes of comparing data numbers and helping to balance all of the budgets of the county collectively. In my presentation today with me, I've included two members of my office. First, Flo Gunderson. She is our office manager. You all know her well from her decades of public service here in the county. And then also a new face, which some may or may not know. This is Mr. Zach Stevens. He is a law school intern with our office for the summer this year, and he assisted on research data and various components of our budget compilation process that we engaged in. So I've asked him to go ahead and sit in, as this is a project that he is personally invested in as well. To start my budget presentation, I'm going to use this screen for presentation purposes. I think it's important to first take a step back and reflect on the year in review for your office. And I think that includes not just the adversities that offices face, which oftentimes leads to the request for budget changes, but also take an opportunity to reflect on the highlights, essentially with what the county gave you last year and in the previous years. What have you been able to accomplish? What are the things that you have to show for it? So I'll start first with that piece, because I think it's an important piece of our analysis. With some of the highlights that our office saw this last year. The first is an expansion of our internship program. Previously, the prosecuting attorney's office had developed an internship program that involves us going out, advertising to various law schools in the area, developing a curriculum, identifying the types of tasks and functions that you believe law school students need to learn in order to maybe someday become prosecuting attorneys. And by doing that, our hope is going to be really threefold. First, it can be a contribution back to the office, and that the work and effort that they put in can help provide a resource to your office at a greatly reduced price from an actual licensed attorney, as evidenced by Mr. Stevens' contributions to our budget. Second component is, I think, really our opportunity to give back as well, which I think as a public entity is equally important. I can speak on behalf of attorneys in particular. We spend the majority of our life initially sitting in a desk and learning and educating ourselves. Being able to take that and then pass it along, I think, is an important part of our job as public servants. The last thing that I think is important and particularly vital for small rural jurisdictions such as ours is the ability to create a pathway for young professionals who may consider someday making this their home. And if we have an opportunity to invest in them at the outset, we may influence their career paths and their decision to perhaps consider a career as a rural prosecuting attorney, which, as you'll see later on in my presentation, is a void, and it's very difficult to find people that are willing to embrace that sort of work. Subsequent to this and the compromise in our office is, in order to house two interns, I had to find a place to put them. And as this commission is well aware, A, working professionals like to have their own space, and B, there are not many unaccounted for office spaces in this courthouse. So I made the very unpopular decision within my office to take both of my deputy attorneys and tell them that from this point forward, they are now going to be sharing office space. I plugged in an intern, created a working space for each of my interns within both of those offices. We made that selection based primarily on the type of work that we thought those interns would be doing and putting them in the office that was most compatible with that type of work. And for the last few months, my deputy prosecutors now have joint office spaces, and they've been able to make it work. We've made do, and I think that it was worth the trade-off for the benefit of being able to expand our internship program. The last piece that's related to our internship program is a partnership with the Idaho Heritage Project. This is a brand new project. I had an opportunity to meet personally with the dean of the law school down at the University of Idaho. I also met with a number of other attorneys who are responsible for helping to facilitate this need. And really what it is, it's an initiative embedded within the University of Idaho, which is designed to identify areas of the legal field in rural parts of the state that are underserved or underrepresented. I submitted all of our data and statistics for Shoshone County. They indicated we clearly qualified to be a applicable location that may be eligible for Idaho Heritage Project funding. And we really pioneered what may be one of the first Idaho Heritage Project funded placements with Zach. So what that enabled us to do with Zach was really bridge the gap for him to be able to relocate to Shoshone County for an internship. It simply wouldn't be practical for him to drive 5 days a week from Moscow, Idaho to Wallace in order to intern with our office. Had that been the case, we likely wouldn't have him. So what we did was I pitched a proposal to the Heritage Project that we would use this funding to offset the cost of living if I could help facilitate temporary housing for him here in the Valley, which, as you know, also isn't easy. Was able to take advantage of some of my community contacts. I'll note in particular Sarah Murphy. She was instrumental in being willing to sit down with me, canvass the group of her contacts of Verbo owners in the area, and we identified a place within walking distance of the courthouse with a homeowner of a Verbo that was willing to engage in a 3-month contract for our intern to be able to take advantage of and help fund that partially through the Heritage Project. So that was an additional new thing, and I think it's definitely a highlight for our office being able to leverage those funds to help the county. Additionally, in this past year, we also wrote a grant through the Moorbeck Foundation, which anyone who has lived in the Silver Valley for any period of time knows that that is a well-established foundation. Its primary goals and targets is facilitating benefits to students and graduates of Wallace High School. And we wrote the Moorbeck Foundation grant based upon our need for succession planning for our legal assistants. That being primarily the fact that we've got a very well-established and veteran crew of legal assistants in my office led by Ms. Gunderson. But it's also a crew which the majority of them are approaching the age of retirement. And 2 of them I would anticipate losing to retirement in the next couple of years. So we're going to need to start planning for that. And the legal assistant role is not one that can really just be learned overnight. There's a lot of pieces that go into it. So one of the things that we did during COVID, we developed standard operating procedures for the basic 30 or so functions that our legal assistants have to do. We assign a group of those SOPs to every one of our legal assistants. They developed a written template for how to perform that function, and we've compiled them into an SOP binder to help facilitate in that succession planning. And pursuant to this grant, we really are trying to open up the door and usher in a young high school student that has an interest in either a future career in the law or a future career in a office admin position. Use some of that grant funding in conjunction with money we may be able to scrounge up within other areas and provide them an opportunity to be willing to say, I'm going to forego working at the coffee stand with all of my friends, which is where it seems many high school students like to go for their summers. And instead, I'm going to spend it in a grungy old office and instead work around a bunch of people who aren't my age, aren't my peers, and I don't know. And really the way that we could try to help bridge that gap is by seeking funding for that type of position. We did that through the Moorbeck Foundation. We wrote a grant application, and we were successfully awarded a grant through that foundation for this purpose. If you can't tell a common theme, my goal as an elected official is to try to do everything I can to maximize the budget I'm given. As you'll notice, we write a lot of grants. in fact, every opportunity I can to facilitate accomplishing the goals that my office needs by using outside resources, I pursue. So much so that I think my office manager has gotten used to any request for funding coming with you're being met with an initial question of, is there any way we can get outside funding for this first? We were successful in doing that this last year. We received 2 separate grants for 2 different trainings that are going to allow both of my deputy prosecuting attorneys to travel out to Alabama and receive specialized training through the Secret Service. It's a training program that I went through about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. It's also a training program that, if accepted, is fully funded. So the submitting office doesn't have to come out of pocket a single dime to pay for the training. They paid for your airfare, they paid for your hotel, and they paid for a full week of training under the advisement of the Secret Service. My chief deputy wrote an application for a grant for that early in the year and got accepted. And then after she completed her training, I had our other deputy attempt the same thing, and he also got accepted for a grant, and so he'll be flying out in October for his training. So both of those, I think, are highlights from this last year. And then once again, one that I know you guys are aware of because it was on your desk, I think, last week, at least in part. Our office teamed up with probation office and our magistrate judge. They worked collaboratively on a grant application to pay for our drug court staff to all fly out to Houston. They did that the end of June, and I was informed that not only did they stay under budget for their grant proposal, but also learned a great deal that they're going to be able to implement now here for Shoshone County. A few more highlights to point out to the group. On the caseload side of things, we had a first-degree murder case that we accounted for in our budget this last year. Seeing the current trends, it's likely the type of case that we will need to be accounting for every year, unfortunately. But a benefit to us is hopefully there will be some padding left in the prosecutor's budget for FY23 at the close of the year, because we didn't have to expend much of the funds that we dedicated and set aside for our first-degree murder, as it's in the process of likely resolving. The defendant in that case has entered a contingent guilty plea, and we're awaiting reports and analysis, which will ultimately dictate whether or not the judge agrees to go along with the proposed mediated resolution in that case. If all of that comes to fruition, that will be a significant chunk of change from this last year's budget that won't need to be expended. So I think that that's a big highlight for us. I say that with the caveat of the fact that my office is always willing to prosecute any case pursuant to our duties and responsibilities. So in no way is this downplaying the fact that our office would have diligently pursued this and prosecuted it to a trial if that was necessary. And that's the reason we accounted for it in the budget. At the same time, we're also exercising our due diligence to do what we can to settle cases where applicable. And fortunately for us, this one appears to have settled. Another success for us, which I know the BOCC is also very, very well aware, is the ultimate resolution of the Silver Mountain tax appeal case and the series of victories that the county was able to see over the last 6 months. 6 months ago, the only thing the county really knew is that the Supreme Court was reversing the district court's decision, and that we would have a much better case moving forward regarding the appeal. Since that 6 months, we really have won nearly every court battle, and I think that that is recouped or mitigated a great deal of cost for the county versus where we would have otherwise been. I personally, something you may or may not be aware of, was selected to participate and be a part of a program called IAL. It stands for the Idaho Academy of Leadership for Lawyers. It is a program developed and implemented by the Idaho State Bar. Each year, IAL seeks out between 15 and 20 attorneys throughout the state that they believe are in a position of significant leadership influence within their role and capacity. This last year I was selected, and contingent upon my participation in that program, I indicated that being an attorney that actually works for a public entity, I didn't necessarily have the same access to funds that perhaps private law firms would, where their attorneys have, $300,000 or $400,000 salaries. That's not me, and that's not this entity. So I indicated to the IL board that I would like to seek some sort of a scholarship or grant to help offset the cost. I wrote that and subsequently was accepted. And so the IL board actually funneled funds back to the county to help offset the cost of my travel and expenses. Additionally, as is the case with most of my training and business trips to Boise, I'm able to leverage rides with family to and from the airport often. And I also tend to crash in my in-laws' house, sometimes even on their couch, so that I usually don't have to incur hotel expenses. So putting all those things together, I was fortunately able to go through and successfully graduate from Idaho State Bar's IL program this year, and did so with very little actual expense to our entity. The last highlight I'll point out related to this grant funding piece. It's another one I know you guys are well aware of. Obviously, the IDOC grant, which implements a diversion program, I think is going to be a significant benefit to our county. And as it relates specifically to my office will be responsible for developing processes and procedures, facilitating the development of the necessary forms to implement the program, and then subsequently cross-training and reevaluating the processes and procedures. So roughly $10,000 worth of that $420,000 grant will actually be funneled back into my department moving forward, help offset the cost of those time expenditures for our role in this program. A final highlight for my office is we do have a very seasoned and veteran legal assistance staff on hand. One of the newest one actually in our office is our victim witness coordinator position. They spend most of their time on victim witness components of the role, and so they don't quite have as much time that is expended in doing other legal assistant tasks such as drafting complaints or doing discovery, etc. My goal has always been to have all of my legal assistants cross-trained across all of the functions that our office serves. And this was our last one that we still had a few pieces to cross-train on. We successfully completed that. And although she's not necessarily going to be expected as the victim witness coordinator to do all of the same functions as some of our other legal assistants, my goal was just to get her the knowledge and the experience so she could help fill in that capacity. Moving now to maybe the not fun part of the year in review is some of the adversities my office faced. I'll start first with the fact that we had a part-time deputy prosecutor position in our budget, and we really exhausted our efforts in trying to hire. We did everything we can. One of the pieces or attempts to solve the issue was to try to collaborate with another community partner who may be willing to share a position with us so we could stay within budget on that position. I made some strides initially with the elected prosecuting attorney in McKinney County, who's since moved on to the bench, so he's no longer the elected prosecuting attorney. And with that, we don't have the agreement in place, and I wasn't able to secure one. All the other public entities I reached out to in hopes of securing such an arrangement indicated that if they were to get someone that they could get in the door, they would be using them full time themselves. So, which I understand. Another thing that was very difficult was attempting to authorize my attorneys to take time off. I think the mental health of our profession is important, especially with some of the things that attorneys see and do. Spending the amount of time they do immersed in that type of work, and the additional added pressure that comes from public scrutiny over your actions can be exhausting. And so I do want to put an importance for my attorneys in giving them time off. But this last year being understaffed and having the workload that we saw coming through the door now really made it very difficult. When time off was allowed for the remaining attorneys in the office, they were oftentimes clocking in 13, 14, 15-hour days. And really, that's not sustainable, and I don't think that's quite the employment model we want to strive for either. The next piece is something I alluded to already, and that's our succession planning. As I noted, we have 2 legal assistants, one of whom we would anticipate retiring within FY24, and the next one would be FY25 or 26. And so we're needing to plan for that. And I really want to make a concerted effort this next year in getting out to some of the undergraduate colleges in the area that have legal assistant programs. So we're able to target somebody that already has the initial training and hopefully even a degree in this area, as this is an area that has now become a degree field, and trying to identify a replacement that we can bring in to really restaff. Moving through additional adversities that our office saw, we had the benefit, and I use the term benefit loosely in this sense. During COVID, much of the state actually saw a plateau of their rising caseload numbers. There was also a number of court hearings that were vacated because of COVID measures. And during that COVID period, we saw a lull in the number of new cases coming in. There could be a number of reasons for that. One of those reasons could have been sheriff's offices and policing departments were sending employees home due to COVID protocols, so there weren't as many officers on shift. There's not as many officers on shift. Maybe you don't have as many cases that are generated. Some other results that could have impacted it was with the court vacating a number of hearings. It could have resulted in some of those cases just being bumped back, right? So the case didn't go anywhere, didn't get resolved, but it's going to move into a docket in the subsequent year. And so for about a 2-year period around COVID, we saw Idaho's population growing, we saw Idaho's caseload growing, and then we got to see a plateau, which I think allowed everyone to kind of breathe, maybe catch up a little bit on some of the growing trends, and have an opportunity to kind of reevaluate how are we going to account for this growth in the future. This year we saw that lull disappear. And I'll chat more about that further on in my presentation. This last year we had more death-related investigations, more search warrant applications, and more court hearings than ever before. All 3 of these categories are categories of significant time expenditure within my office and within the court system in general. Next, we had an exponential increase in the amount of civil matters that my office saw. These included civil appeals, lawsuits and threatened lawsuits, and just general advisement that was needed for the various departments and elected officials around the county. Obviously, those advisements are important because if they're not given and my office doesn't dedicate the time and energy necessary to make ourselves available to advise department heads and other elected officials, we open ourselves up for liability. And when we do that, potential financial consequences are much more than if you had just dedicated the time and the resources to give proper advisement at the outset. Last but not least, and a point of familiarity even to our member of the community here, Shoshone County got to see 2 petitions for road validations this last year that both went up on appeal to the courts. In my 8 years here, I don't know that I have seen the amount of workload for road validations as we saw this last year. So for those that know what goes into a road validation appeal at the district court level, it is quite a bit of work. The budget piece, which I'll dive into now, I think is going to involve a couple of components. First, I think it's going to involve just looking from a 30,000 point view at our budget and a holistic approach to that budget. For FY23 compared to FY24, you'll note that there is an increase in my proposed budget from 718,000 to 861. How we get there, is really in just a handful of categories. And I've done my best to highlight on my budget request worksheet for you here where that comes from. So these are all the changes. Some of these changes are predictable, right? Based upon the initial numbers which my office received from the clerk of what the commissioners thought may be anticipated for a code increase. We generated our code increases based on a 5% increase. So that's going to account for some of that. We see that 5% COLA there on my budget worksheet. When we look at some of the other increases, I'll point you to column 6 through, or row 6 through 13 and the various columns associated with that. Most of these costs, as you're going to see, are all inflation related costs. They're pretty standard costs regarding inflation. Candidly, and I know my opinion is biased, but I don't know that any of those inflation costs are exorbitant. I mean, I'm not asking for any of those categories to double or triple. Right, they're moving up at standard rates. I did my best to analyze all of the categories and identify which ones I think I could account for not raising due to inflation. And these were the categories that I found may need to come up for inflation. An additional piece that you're going to see here is there's going to be hopefully a one-time purchase of a copy machine that's going to account for an additional $10,000 into that category. That proposal is based upon a recommendation that I think the BOCC is considering to shift the format and system of the way we do copying. Should the BOCC choose to not go that route and not purchase our own equipment, obviously that number would be moot. I've included that number based on a recommendation of the direction that it's my understanding the BOCC is contemplating or considering moving. This brings me to really where the bulk of my increase comes from, and it comes from this piece. It's a little bit fuzzy, I know, just because it got zoomed in, but this is the creation of what I'm categorizing as a new position. I'll discuss more on how identifying it as a new position may or may not be the most accurate way of doing it, but for context and purposes of discussion, I've identified it as a new position here. This position is really to take what is currently in my budget as a part-time deputy, which I've demonstrated over the last year. Really, there's no market for it and can't be filled, and actually converted to a position that's fillable, that being a full-time position. As we move forward, you'll see in the actual current budget and the master spreadsheet for the prosecuting attorney's fund, you'll see that this position, there's already a category for it under 404. So that exists. It hasn't been funded under that category, but the position's there, right? So you can see here where we've got the elected official, the chief deputy, and we've actually got these 2 categories for deputy prosecutors. Under the previous format, we have zeroed out this position and didn't have any money dedicated to it, and instead rolled the money for a part-time position into a different contracts related category, under the hope that we might be able to find a different public entity to fund the position and we could just reimburse the contract. That revealing itself that it's not practical, decided to convert it back, and I'm asking to refund this position. Obviously, to do it, we would be scraping the money back out of that contracts line item, funneling it through here, and that's where you really see where I've identified that we've got these other areas, particularly the labor contracts, which I believe accounts for $34,000, would be moved back over. And if you put that in conjunction with some of the grant funding I have obtained for my office in order to help fund the prosecuting attorneys, realistically, if we look at this from the standpoint that the BOCC is going to fund the 3 positions that are already there, and we consider our outside funding sources as just going toward this new position, we see that adding those 3 lines up, we're able to account for $74,000 of that salary out of outside funding sources and money that was previously in that contracts line item. Now analyzing a different category, which some departments do or don't have as part of their analysis. My department does have it as part of our analysis. And because of that, I think that it's important to bring up and mention within this setting, and that is the anticipated revenue that I believe my office can bring into the county. Anticipated revenue from FY23 was $90,249. What I anticipate the revenue that my office can generate in 24, assuming that we are given what we've requested in the budget is going to be 113,533. To put that into context and to show you how that's calculated, I've included a updated anticipated revenue spreadsheet. I went ahead and just kind of moved things around and reformatted it from the actual anticipated revenue spreadsheet, which was submitted. The one previously just has what's anticipated for the year. I went ahead and broke this out and added a new column so we can do a comparison analysis for FY23 and 24 and give you an opportunity to understand where that money is coming in from. There are a couple of things that I think we can put an emphasis on for increased revenue this next year, and I'll pull these out and highlight them for you. First off, we've got an increase in the anticipated revenue for our STOP grant. So this is a grant that we have continued to write for. We've got grant reporting requirements, which require us to demonstrate its success, but we've been able to do that in Shoshone County. And as such, we've been successful in resubmitting for that grant by demonstrating its success. The second line item that we will note increases on the revenue side of the budget is actually a line item for a contract that's kind of unique. So various cities within the county have a desire to have policing services within their city. What I think the public easily recognizes that in order to have policing services, you have to have law enforcement out there. You can have someone in a uniform conducting the policing. What sometimes the public doesn't recognize is that on the backside of that, that policing is all for naught if you don't have an attorney on the back end to actually enforce whatever work the officers are doing. For most cities, it makes the most sense for them to separate those out. It allows them to treat both differently. If the policing services aren't meeting their expectations, they can go out and get a new department to provide those services. If their attorney's not meeting their expectations, they can go out and get a new attorney to meet those expectations. And so this is pretty common for cities to go out and seek contracts for both of those services if it's not something they're going to provide in-house. One of the unique things that Shoshone County has for it is that one of our cities, being the city of Wallace, has agreed, based upon previous negotiations, to extend a contract to the county for a package deal, which lumps together both the policing and the prosecution. My office has agreed to sign off on that and provide the prosecution services within our capacity as the county prosecuting attorney pursuant to this contract. And when the contract was negotiated, it had the requisite termination clauses that are needed for public entities that would allow the public entity to back out of the contract. But we entered it with a good amount of reliance on each side for the public entities to say, I'm going to trust that you're going to make this a priority to see this contract through for the full term. That contract was designed to be front loaded on the side of law enforcement, meaning that the annual increases or steps up in the annual raises would be front loaded to help our sheriff's office and back loaded for the prosecuting attorney. So what you'll see is that we're entering into year 5 of that 5-year contract, and we're now going to see the largest increase for that contract. So our office as the prosecuting attorney for the county is able to bring in this next year $24,000 into that contract back into my office to offset the cost that our office expends in facilitating the prosecution for the investigations that come out of the city limits of Wallace. Lastly is this $10,000 chunk, and I mentioned that previously as a revenue that is going to be funneled back into the prosecuting attorney's office by way of our role within the pre-prosecution diversion program that's going to be implemented. When we compare these two, just to put it all into context, based upon the numbers that I've proposed, my proposed budget this next year for FY24 will see a 19% increase. My proposed anticipated revenue that I believe I can bring in is a 25% increase. So I'm pointing this out to demonstrate to the commissioners that for every percentage I'm asking for in a budget increase, I'm willing to ensure my office is working hard to keep up or exceed the same percentage of revenue that we're committing to try to bring into the county. Where I want to expound, and I mentioned this already, is that the bulk of that increase is going to come in on our aid budget. Here's a spreadsheet that shows a budget. You'll see at the bottom of the aid budget, got my case manager and the legal assistance with the victim witness coordinator included in that. As noted previously, we've written a grant for our victim witness coordinator, which helps to offset that cost that's associated with her services. And when we look at the A budget, this is where we see this deputy PA line item that was previously zeroed out being implemented once again. So we're going to reopen this position, take the money that was in the labor contracts, shift it over. And if we add in the money that we received from outside sources, as I noted previously, it'll make up roughly 74,000 of the 89,000 that's needed for the salary part of that position. To help the commissioners and the public understand why I believe this is a need, I want to take a minute and reflect on the health of the office. I dive into this portion of the presentation and note that this is my analysis as the head of the department and the elected official, observing the type and the nature of work that my office staff does, and also comparing the pay that my office receives to other public entities around the state, and particularly public entities that I believe are similarly situated to us. When we take a look at that, there are two areas of particular importance I want to focus my analysis on, and that is the workload of those employees to help make this visual aid easier to see and understand. I've just summarized these things into one of three categories. Green being that I believe this area of the office is in a healthy state. Yellow is an area of the office that I think needs improvement. And red is an area of the office that I believe is absolutely not sustainable. And if we continue functioning without addressing that, I think there are going to be serious repercussions for the county. Looking first at the workload, I think my legal assistants certainly feel like there are plenty of days where there is more work to be done than they have time for. So it's something that I would like to be able to address in the future, something that I think needs improvement, but not something that I think is so significant that I have to address in this budget year necessarily. Some areas that I think are healthy. I think our victim witness coordinator is doing really good on her workload. She's in a position where we can enable her to take time off when it's requested. She is also comparing her numbers to case averages of victim witness coordinators around the state. I think she's where she needs to be in keeping us on par with other jurisdictions. So I think that area of our office is healthy. And for the reasons I expounded on at the outset of my presentation, I think our internship program is really healthy. Our interns are working hard, but myself having been an intern, I think that it's an expectation when you're an intern that you're going to be working hard, and I think they've been doing a great job for us. I also hope, and maybe you can pick Zach's brain on a morning over a cup of coffee, but my hope is that they're also feeling like they're able to take away a lot. So I hope that the work they've been asked to do is fulfilling for them. I would highlight that as an area that I think is healthy in our office right now. The pay component, when you look at the pay that our legal assistants and our victim witness coordinator are receiving, and you compare it across state averages, you'll see that our county is underpaying those two categories of individuals. Obviously, that's something that I would love to see us address moving forward in the future at some point. As far as our deputy prosecuting attorney is concerned, I think his pay is in a good position. I would consider it healthy in regards to what other deputy prosecutors are making. And as far as our chief deputy PA is concerned, although she definitely falls below kind of that median threshold, I'd still categorize it as healthy. I think she is younger in her career, so she doesn't have quite as many years of experience, whereas some other chief deputy prosecuting attorneys, I think maybe have a few more years of experience under their belt. And so that's how I'm able to justify saying that her pay is what I would put in a healthy category, considering really her number of years of service here in the jurisdiction and the number of years she's been in her current position as a chief deputy. The elected prosecuting attorney, It's problematic. I'll show you the numbers. I also understand that that's my own personal position, but we'll analyze the numbers and I'll show you where it's at so that you guys can make your own assessment of that. Our interns, I'm happy with where we're at. We went out and we advertised this year. We actually got to advertise more pay than I was anticipating because we didn't hire a deputy prosecutor. So I had some money sitting around in the contracts line item in a budget. And that's maybe part of the reason why we were able to actually pull in Zach, because we were able to use the Heritage Project funds to pay the housing piece. And then we were able to have money in our budget to actually pay him for some of the work he's doing. I'd say the majority of the work he's doing is still volunteer work. But some of the work he's doing, I'm able to pay him for. And so I hope that that's a big benefit to him and was able to justify and be a reason why he came out and worked for us. So I think that we're healthy in that area. I'll note this as a side note. The days of having strict volunteer interns, I think, are gone. If we didn't assign pay to our internships, I just don't think we'd have any applicants. So I think that that's just the necessary understanding for us to have moving forward. With that said, the two most significant areas is our workload for our attorneys, and the pay for one particular category is grossly under state averages. I'll start first with that category and I'll run us through some of the numbers. So this graph, I know there's a lot on the screen, so I'm going to give you guys time to analyze and look over it. As prosecuting attorney, of the 44 counties, you either report as considering that your work within the county is equivalent of a full-time position or not. So there are some counties where the elected prosecuting attorney maybe only works 2 days a week or something like that. That county would not be categorized as having a full-time PA. These are all the counties in Idaho that do categorize having a full-time prosecutor, meaning the prosecutor believes they dedicate roughly the equivalent of what their county classifies as being full-time to their position. Of the full-time elected prosecuting attorneys, you can see where Shoshone's at. Additionally, I'll throw into this graphic, and if the elected prosecutor in Lewis County wants to give me a call afterwards, that's fine. I'll take the beating from him. I've looked at Lewis County's caseload numbers, and they have roughly a quarter of the caseload we have. So I would argue that maybe it is categorized as full-time, maybe it is a full-time benefited position. I don't know that we would consider that full-time in the context of maybe the number of hours some of these other elected prosecutors work. Once again, don't have that information. I'm just comparing their caseload and the size of the county with the size of that county. That prosecuting attorney is still reporting as full-time, so I've included him in the graph. But other than that, that is the only prosecuting attorney that's paid less than our county pays ours.
I can tell you that Teton, Oneida, or no, Oahe, Teton, Oahe Valley, and Franklin and Fremont are the counties that we use for comparison because they are within 2,000 of population growth.
Yeah,
you can see everybody's way above.
This number is the number that I'll use for my presentation, and I'm guessing may be a number the sheriff's office uses for their presentation. But as you are aware, even within Shoshone County, our caseload is grossly disproportionate to our actual population. And so when we take that into account, to Tammy's point in part, there are some other outside factors that we would need to consider. I'll share from experience. I actually know the elected prosecutor in Lemhi very well. I actually worked inside of that office. And he may hate me for saying this, but he usually works about 3 days a week. And so even though he's reporting as full-time, and he is a full-time benefited position for the county, you can see where his 3 days a week equates to his salary in a county that's roughly half our size. I'm putting this graphic up there so that way you guys just understand that these are really the numbers we're working with. When we highlight those, we look at some of the lowest ones. And what I will do is I'll pull up the 10 lowest paid counties. And what I've done here is I've compared the actual criminal case filings in that county. And so what you'll see is we start here at Lucas County, and you can see they have the lowest number of case filings of any full-time prosecuting attorney. They have 500 roughly case filings in a year. Their salary is $77,000. You'll see as we go up, we've got Oneida. They've got 900 case filings. We're seeing an increase in salary that's generally trending with the number of cases in the county. So if we were using caseload instead of population, this is how our graphic would look. Now, Lemhi County, for instance, they don't even make the graphic because they're not even part of the 10 lowest, even though they would be way down here on caseload, right? So this is just using the 10 lowest. We can still see, even with the 10 lowest, this trend. Obviously, there's a few exceptions. Here we have Benawah County, which has a decrease in caseload, but yet is getting paid more than some of those others, and is also a neighboring competing county to us. We go up, we start to see this trend still slowly moving up. And then we get to Shoshone County, and it's the only county that has this grossly disproportionate rate between caseload and the amount that the elected prosecutor is getting paid. So those are the numbers. I'm not trying to hide any statistics from the board or from the community. I'm just laying them out there, and that's where it sits. Looking back at these concerns, I'll shift my focus to the second piece, which is the workload. There are a number of things that contribute, in my opinion, to the increased workload of the prosecutor's office this last year. First is an increase in the number of case filings. Second was an increase in the number of court hearings. Third was the nature of the types of cases that were being prosecuted. Fourth is an increase in the number of death investigations. Fifth is the amount of search warrants our office wrote and processed. And lastly, is a whole myriad of factors that go into the civil litigation piece, which is more difficult to quantify because we don't have the data tracking and the numbers that I can use like I can in the criminal sphere, other than telling you that the number of emails and phone calls I get related to our civil matters has increased exponentially. Looking first at the criminal case filings, we see in 2020, we had 1,800. In 2021, that number grew to 1,922. We see that plateau I referenced from COVID, right? So we're still growing, still an increase, but it's slower, which was welcomed. Then we jump forward to where we're at in our current projections for 2023, and we're back on the same type of trend we saw pre-COVID. Putting it into a line graph, you can see that COVID plateau that I referenced. You can see the previous trend, and then you can see the current trend even steeper than it was pre-COVID. The nature of cases also impacts the amount of resources that are required in order to prosecute them without exposing the county to liability. First off, we've seen an increase in the type and nature of crimes, meaning more misdemeanors turning into felonies, more felonies are turning into more significant felonies. We've seen a big uptick in the number of drug trafficking cases. That is, rather than stopping as many individuals as were simple users, we're now conducting more investigations and prosecuting more individuals for trafficking level amounts of possession. And lastly, violent offenses have gone up. When we look at Shoshone County, I think a metric we can use or leverage to give ourselves an idea of what kind of drug usage is in our county is the number of drug overdoses we have. Historically, it's no secret that Shoshone County has been one of the highest overdose rate counties in the state. That trend continues. I think the most recent statistic I pulled when I was doing my budget research showed that we are fourth highest in the state this year. And maybe that's better than the last couple of years, some of which we've been number one. But we're still at the top end of that. Likewise, we see a consistent and likely collaborated trend with our year-over-year drug crime rates. When we compare ourselves to our neighboring jurisdictions, we see that are drugs increasing in Idaho in total? Yes, they are. Are they increasing disproportionate to Shoshone County? They are. This metric was pulled from a new resource that allows citizens to track opioid overdoses. And as you'll see, our opioid overdoses for Shoshone County, opioids being the type or nature of drug that seems to be most prevalent for ODs. Shoshone County is much higher than average as opposed to some of our neighboring counties. Shifting now to our death investigations, you'll see I did an analysis just from last year to this year. Last year we were at 22 death investigations. This year we're at 27, and the year's not even over. So we're halfway through the year and we've already surpassed last year's number. Out of those 22 investigations last year into deaths, local law enforcement determined that one of those 22 should be charged as a homicide. This year, we're halfway through the year and we've already charged 5 counts of homicide. So I think that is important for us to recognize that that's a significant burden on both my office and other offices around the courthouse. The number of search warrants that our office has processed, I was able to pull numbers going back the past 3 years. You'll see in 2020, we processed 9 search warrants through the Shoshone County PA's office. 21, we had 17. 2022, we had 22. And based on our current numbers as of the midpoint of the year, that being July 1, I split the year in half and use that to base my projections for the whole year. We'll be at 44 years then. So if we look at where we came since 2020, going from 9 to 44 is a 700% increase for those that like percentage numbers. A second area of significant burden is the number of law days which are being scheduled in Shoshone County. This is a number that the clerk can also use, and feel free to steal this slide because anytime that this graphic shows up, this means that my prosecuting attorneys in my office are having to prep for additional days. They're having to take a day off from performing work and tasks on other cases, and they are in the courtroom all day. Alongside of them is a court clerk who is now in the courtroom all day. And so I thought this number was pretty insightful. I won't give a lot of comment on it for political and other reasons, but the graphic's there, so you can make of it what you like.
And we don't really have any control over it.
We don't.
It impacts, well,
We don't get to set the number of court days.
No. So it's the district court budget, the court recorder's budget, and the prosecutor's budget are all hit by all of these things that you're seeing. When they have another case, that's more paperwork for the people in court records, and it's more work in district and magistrate court.
So for clarity for the public, who's setting the number of court days?
The administrative office of the courts, the administrative district judge. I mean, there's a number of players at the table. Your local district judge, so whoever actually has the docket themselves, I think has a say in saying, based upon my caseload and the number of cases coming through my county now, this is how many days I think I need to get through all those cases. And that's how that number is determined. Civil litigation demands, as I already noted, this is one that's difficult to quantify. It's difficult to quantify because there's a few things that maybe we can pull some data on, but for the most part, it's hard to say, yeah, I answered the phone this many times today and fielded questions. And also, candidly, it's, not all of that time or cost effective for me to say I'm already spending this much time on things like public records request. I'm going to spend this much more time calculating the numbers, right? It's just stuff you do as it comes in. You try to get through it. You try to reduce the county's liability, but oftentimes you don't keep track of it. And so that's why it's a little more difficult to quantify. There are a few areas that I'll point out. I think generally in our culture, there's an increase in a litigious mindset and an increase in that type of mindset for people that are moving into the area anew. And so when we consider that, I think we see a higher likelihood of getting things like tort claims on our desk for people wanting us to pay for automobile expenses and repairs. right? So I think that sort of facet of the job has increased just with the general trend in society. Related to it likely is the fact that we're seeing an uptick in people that are wanting to appeal their taxes, which is additional burden on the county. And although the initial burden at the outset definitely incurs some costs to the county in sorting through all of those tax appeals, I think the real significant burden is what happens when one of those cases has to be run all the way up the ladder, as we saw in the Silver Mountain case, right? If a tax appeal case reaches that level, you're talking about a significant burden on a public entity. And I think we're seeing an increase in the types and nature of cases that people are willing to contest to that extent. In Shoshone County, we've had multiple notices of tort claims in the last year. There's definitely been an uptick in those. We have a large increase in the number of post-conviction relief cases. And this is something I can't quantify because I do have a way of tracking it. It's also something I can quantify because they come around so rarely and there's so much time and effort. We have a really good paper trail because we know if we have a post-conviction case, I'm having to pull my office manager and whichever prosecuting attorney I'm going to assign to it, and they're spending tens of dozens of hours on that one single case. These are a huge burden to the county when they come along.
Can you define that for me a little more?
I certainly can. So a post-conviction case is really the last bite of the apple. It's what happens when a defendant is typically when they're convicted. So you move a case all the way forward through a jury trial. Most often you get a conviction, the person is sentenced, they appeal that sentence. They have an opportunity to appeal that all the way up to the Supreme Court potentially. Fortunately, that area of cases is handled outside of our office. The way Idaho is structured, criminal appeals up to the appellate courts is handled by the AG's office. Unlike civil appeals, which is why we had to handle something like Silver Mountain ourselves, criminal appeals, once they go up to the appellate courts, we wash our hands of them. And as long as we did a good job when it was in our lap, typically the AG's office can succeed on those appeals and uphold our conviction. The criminal appeals up to the appellate courts uses the record from all of the previous hearings. So essentially the parties are just arguing based upon what happened here. We're going to write a brief. We're going to tell the court in 10 or 20 pages why the conviction should or shouldn't be upheld, and the matter's going to be done. Once all of that's exhausted, the last bite of the apple is to file a civil lawsuit, the best way of putting it. And you file a civil lawsuit against the government. This is called a post-conviction relief claim. There is an entire act that discusses how these cases shall proceed, and a brand new case starts over from scratch. And the entire dealings of that case are analyzing the criminal proceedings in a civil lawsuit setting. So there's the exchange of discovery, there's a generation of transcripts, full compilation of the court record. That's an aspect that the clerks have to provide, so they have to compile the court record for it. And then the parties engage in civil litigation, exchange of discovery. There can be deposition of witnesses, hiring of experts potentially.
It can also be change of judge. They bring in a judge and they got to pay all their expenses.
Yeah. So these are a big burden. They're rare, but when they do come along, they can have a significant impact. And we'll jump to that on the next slide. First, we already discussed the road validation appeal cases. You guys know how much goes into that. Mr. Beaner's here on behalf of the public. He knows what goes into those. There's a lot that goes into them. And then in Shoshone County, we've had a number of unique matters that presented themselves this last year. And although I would love to say that some of these are isolated, I kind of think the trend of the county is moving toward unique matters in general just being more prevalent, right? So maybe it's not this unique matter that presents itself next year, but it's something else that's unique that we don't do often. And we saw an uptick in just the total volume of those, right? We had everything as odd as having to petition a district court for assigning a new board to a taxing district. We had AG's office in conducting a number of different investigations that my office had to collaborate with on. We sold and purchased county property to a dollar amount and extent that exceeds any prior precedent. So we've had these kind of things that were unique this last year. And I think We're likely just going to see more of those as we start seeing new, more and different types of people moving into the county. We'll take a look at this post-conviction piece. So post-conviction relief cases, as I noted, they're rare. So I pulled the last 3 years. 2020, we had 2 of them. 2021, we had 1 of them. 2022, we had 1 of them. And we're only midway through the year in 23, and we've already got 3 this year alone. So for us, that's a big jump. I'm bringing my presentation kind of full circle, and I'm kind of getting to the conclusion. When I sat down and I was putting together my presentation, I really wanted to try to summarize what I viewed my goal as legal counsel on a budget presentation to be. And this was probably the best way that I could reduce it to words. I won't read it off verbatim for you. You can read it. But I really view that as the role of legal counsel in presenting their budget. As we come back full circle to where we started the conversation, we've got the budget increases. I already highlighted where a bulk of that increase is coming. It's all going to come in that one line item of 404. There's a number of other increases, the COLAs across the board. So if the county commissioners choose to go higher than 5%, those numbers will be adjusted up. If they look at all the county employees and say we'd like our COLA to be less than 5% for the county, those numbers would come down. I entirely defer to your discretion as the county commissioners in identifying what you believe is appropriate in those categories. The categories that I think we need to keep track of for inflation are rows 6 through 13. I think that, or even really 6 through 12. Category 13 is really a directive on where we're going to go as far as equipment's concerned as a county. So 6 through 12 are really the categories that I think we need to analyze for inflation so we can keep up with inflation costs. And then this 404 item is really, it's where the bulk of that increase is going to fall for my office. When we look at the health of the office, I'm going to come back full circle and say there are these 2 primary categories that I think are a serious health concern to the county. Understanding that budgets are limited, understanding that there are a number of departments within this county that all have good justification and good reasons for why they need increases in their budget. What I'm proffering to the Board of County Commissioners is really my plea for this next year is I'm willing to forget about this category altogether. We can table that to next year. I'll continue with the trend where it's at. Not going to complain about it. As long as I've got the reassurances that we recognize that it's an issue and we do our best to try to make up for it and get our county to where it should be on the state averages moving forward at some point in the future. If we can just put an emphasis on solving this workload dilemma by funding a prosecuting attorney in a full capacity for that 4th position and converting it from a partial position, which has proven to be unfillable. So with that out of the way and with my presentation having concluded, I'm happy to answer any questions that BOCC has, the clerk may have for me, and or otherwise.
Explain the duties of your 2 deputy prosecuting attorneys, because Brittany's got quite a bit more workload than the other.
Yeah, so it's designed to be fluid to some degree. I treat my prosecuting attorneys in a similar capacity to my legal assistants in that I don't want to isolate them and put them in a box. I want to do my best to try to cross-train everyone as best as possible and get everyone exposure to every type of case that can come through the office. So that if something were to happen, someone were to wind up in a hospital, something like that, I can shift the focus of the workload and plug somebody in where they need to go. That said, every one of the attorneys in my office spends a little bit of time doing a little bit of everything. So some of that's shared. I'll give you guys an example of that. We had a question on a public records request come through this week. I thought it was a pretty basic question that could be answered. on the category of, difficulty 1 to 10. It was maybe a 1 or 2 difficulty for a legal analysis. So I took that as a good opportunity to funnel that project to my newest deputy prosecutor, right? So he's getting some exposure and experience working through the Public Records Act. That said, the majority of public records request questions funnel through me because the current structure has me serving the primary role for the civil aspects of the county, the primary role for all of our major felony crimes. Our general felony workload, so the vast majority of everything that comes through district court, everything from our drug trafficking to, our LML to, grand theft, those cases have primary responsibility assigned to Brittany, who's my chief deputy. I've tried to push off just about everything in magistrate court to my entry-level deputy, Scott, right now. But ideally, it would be best to have more than one attorney having a share of the felony workload and more than one attorney having a share of the magistrate workload. So that way you have the ability to cover more cases with less time. As such, the end result is primary responsibility for our magistrate caseload, which includes misdemeanor crimes, infractions, child protected cases, juvenile matters, those sorts of caseloads. Those are primarily funneling to Scott. If there are ones that are a little more complex, I'll either assign them to myself or to Brittany to step in and take. If there are some that have overlap with other areas of our caseload, I may assign it to the most experienced attorney to handle all related cases, even if they fall into other categories. And so that's the general breakdown of the current arrangement. Other
My turn?
questions?
You have questions?
I have some clarifications on what I did. So, there is, on the 402, currently in the stop grant, we were using that money for there, so that's why I lowered that. I can bump it back up if we can get the additional deputy prosecutor hired, the new position, because I have to put that money somewhere and that comes out of this budget. So
Sure.
anytime there's grant money involved, there's a grant that it's tracked in and those dollars are not shown here. So the revenue wouldn't be shown here. We would take it out of the expense line and put it towards the grant. So they do JVs to move that back and forth. And that goes for the drug task force. The IDOC one will be that way. The, what was that other one called? Can't remember. ILED or no, yeah, ILED. So they're not here, so you won't see those funds here. And I took them out and I just took it out because that's what we've been doing, but I can put that back in for the budget and then it will be basically what you've got. I think I've had a couple other minor things. Of course, by reducing it in one place, I affect all the budget numbers for benefits.
Sure.
Not all of them, but a lot of them. Telephone, I brought back down to what it should be based
Okay.
on what we're doing. So I lowered that.
Okay.
That's really all I did, Laura.
Okay.
I can fix salaries. You guys are planning to approve that second person, and I'll just leave it where it is on the 404 one.
404 stuff.
404 would be what it is, and I would make 402 back to 89,250, and then and I'll adjust the benefits.
Makes sense.
I'll do those.
Dave, Tracy, any other questions for me?
See the need and figure out where to get it all, but I see the need. Crime doesn't pay, it costs. It costs everybody.
And I guess just based on, thank you for putting all those numbers together.
Yes, sir.
It's
Awesome.
very, very good presentation. And I'll echo what Ben said, that what they do in their office is their workload increases, so does that as court records and the judges and the in-court clerks. They all go together. And when all of that stuff propagates, it affects the girls down here when they do all the financials tracking as well as my job.
Triple effect.
It is a trickle effect, and I would highly recommend that you look at the IAC's wage study that they do every year. And the comparisons, we are very, very low. Most of the counties, I compare us with those other 5 because they're closest in population. But then you also have to factor in their uniquenesses. Do they have I-90 going through them?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
it's a huge difference.
I mean, consistent with that, I know I've had discussions with our county assessor before, right? In analyzing, well, the same counties that it's good for me to compare to may not be the same counties it's good for him to compare to, right? For him, he may be putting a heavy emphasis on population. He may be also be putting a heavy emphasis on total land mass and the amount of parcels within the jurisdiction. For my office, I don't care how many parcels there are in the jurisdiction.
Nope.
My key number is what's the caseload. Right? What's the number of cases we have coming through the system that need prosecuted and handled? And so similarly, I think the clerks, you may be
Same
maybe the
thing.
broadest because you've got to kind of,
I'm everywhere, yeah.
land mass may
yours.
impact,
Yep.
population may impact. I know the sheriff's office historically is reached out to my office for numbers because their biggest impact on numbers is caseload.
Okay.
So for our 2 offices, when we do some of these comparisons, really looking at caseload is where you get the best analysis. And then when you consider that some of the reporting counties under the IAC survey may have numbers they're reporting for certain elected officials. Some of those elected officials are not 40-hour elected officials, right? So then when you're comparing it, and I know I use Lemhi County just because I don't think Bruce would mind me giving him a little jab. I think it's a great example of, a county that has significantly less hours going through their office than ours. So for all intents and purposes, it wouldn't even be a good comparison, yet they're still, as far as the salary is concerned, over $30,000 a year higher than us.
Exactly.
And so I think that when you look at those kinds of comparisons, each department is a little different. Each department is comparing themselves to a little different group if you're trying to look for analogous jurisdictions.
Mhm.
And if the board wouldn't mind and would oblige me, I'd be happy to open up the floor to questions from public if they have any for me about anything I presented.
Oh, yeah, we were gonna do that. Are there any further questions from the board?
No, you're gonna share that.
It's a written
No, Lacey.
communication now, so it is a public record. So
Just got videotaped, so.
I will be happy to save and print these slides.
All right,
Yeah,
opening
I
it up
gotta
to
bring
the,
up the one that jumps out at me is expert fees,
Go for it.
1%, and you've only spent $144 and 90 cents in 3 days. I know you gotta have something in there, but it's $10,000 realistic.
It is likely under budget the year you get hit with the first degree murder that goes to trial. So the question then shifts to, do you want to plan for something and have the benefit of that money rolling back into your budget at the end of the year? Or do you not want to plan for it and then be in a bind where you can't afford the necessary expenses for that type of a case? So in meeting with the clerk, I think the $10,000 number for expert fees on a first degree murder case is under budget, but it's at least something there as a placeholder to say, maybe if we do get a first degree murder case that looks like it's going to trial, maybe we can just try to expend the $10,000 in year 1 and then know this is an active case, and next year we got to beef it up to pay for the rest of the expenses to keep our head above water. So that's really the reason for that placeholder.
Yeah.
You are one of the closest to your fiscal year, 78%. And you spent what, 71% so far that we've met on. So you are within, and last year's budget, you were pretty good on it. But do want to make this statement, the comparables to the counties. Not in your case, though, but this was brought up a couple of years ago about pay raises for counties. You also have to compare apples to apples. You start looking at the insurance benefits, the deductibles, but nobody wants to do that. They want to look at just the pay. There's a lot of difference there. And just throwing out the pay, what somebody makes compared to the insurance and everything else is two different things.
And I could add that the IC's website where they do the comparison also has the benefit information on there as well, so you can compare that.
That's where I get my stuff, is IDC.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, as a spinoff of IAC, the Prosecuting Attorneys Association also does their own inquiry, and that's one's a little more in depth. And so that's where I usually pull my info from. And that gives me the ability to break things down further for comparative analysis. And that's how I can identify things such as part-time versus full-time prosecutors, right, for some of my graphics. So
Good
The,
info out there.
the computer operations line item, you're at 143%, but we're budgeting for less than you spent this year for next year. Is that something we expect to go back down?
I defer to my office manager maybe for some input on that, if Will, you want to weigh in on that.
Well,
So it's going to be 677-0003.
your computer
It's our
operations.
computer operations line item.
It's right here. Is it for your new people that you had to
Mhm.
support 2 network connections in an office now?
Yep.
Compared to 1, 2 computers.
So we
That's
don't
where those
expect it to
things
keep
go.
going up.
No, not normally.
Don't expect it. I think that realistically with that new infrastructure put into place, that gives us the ability to house, for instance, once our interns leave for the summer, the hope is we bring in full-time prosecutor and now the infrastructure is already there in place
Right.
for them. So as part of an expense that we viewed, now that you bring up what went into it, we viewed that as really a long-term investment. So it's all coming back to me now with Flo and I met. We thought that that number would hopefully go down. It'll probably go up a little bit more before the year's over, but then the hope would be it's going to come down in subsequent years.
Just a technical question. So if we do approve, figure out how to bring in another deputy prosecutor, where are we gonna put them?
I've already got the offices rearranged, so they're going to be in-house. Scott's office has already been reformatted. We've converted the back wall table into desk space now. So what used to be a wall table now is housing their computer workstations, and they're now sharing a actual desk in their office for meetings. So we've got one centralized desk that we just moved into the middle of the room. I put both of them up against the wall. Unfortunately, they don't get to meet necessarily in privacy anymore, but that's the compromise for us trying to get them the staff they need to get their workload where it is. So that's how they're working. Kyle is our 2L intern. He has a limited license this year that he applied for and received from the state. And so he's able to actually handle cases for us right now. In fact, he's in the courtroom this morning handling cases as an attorney with a limited license. So
Thank you. Any further questions or comments or thoughts? Okay. Anything from you, Madam Clerk?
Nope, I'll make that change if you let me make it.
What's your thoughts on that?
And you can make it back when you go through everything, because this is part of current expense.
Yeah, I think can do that and we can look at it again.
You'll look at it the first week of August,
Yeah.
make your final decision.
Any further comments or questions from you, Mr. Prosecutor?
thank you guys for your time and giving elected officials the opportunity. I know some may or may not take advantage of it, but it's important to me. So I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity and coming, not only explain where my office has been, but where I foresee it going and what's needed to keep the county out of liability. So thank you guys.
I think it's good for everyone.
Yeah.
The all sides.
All right. Well, with that, we will close this meeting. As we have more